Alberta allowed Christian musician Sean Feucht's worship night to proceed on the Legislature Grounds as other cities tried to shut him down. Meanwhile, newly reviewed federal records show most Alberta First Nations haven't publicly posted audits in years after Ottawa stopped enforcing the First Nations Financial Transparency Act. Alberta Transportation Minister Devin Dreeshen waded into Edmonton's bike lane fight and actually showed up in Delton to hear more about concerns from residents. Edmonton City Council also approved a $50,000 pilot to deploy cameras and microphones against noisy vehicles, prompting privacy concerns. All that and more on this week's Alberta Roundup. I'm your host, Isaac Lamoureux, and let's jump into that first story right away. So Christian singer and Let Us Worship founder Sean Feucht wrapped up his Canadian tour with a stop at Alberta's Legislature Grounds, one of just two Canadian cities that allowed his event to proceed, with the other being Saskatoon, after a string of last-minute permit cancellations elsewhere. Thousands gathered to pray, sing, and as Feucht framed it, participate in revival, which he deemed was not a concert. He said that it was, quote, to see the lost, save the sick, and see the Lord come alive. Feucht said, quote, the greater the resistance, the greater the breakthrough, arguing that hostile coverage and protests have only strengthened the movement. He repeatedly emphasized a spiritual turning point, saying, quote, God is moving in this nation. Feucht and his band, which were from Calgary, played music while prayer was a constant throughout the night, and it began with everyone, in fact, joining hands and praying. Prayers continued throughout the night, including a moment where those who had attempted suicide in recent years raised their hands to be prayed over, and students also volunteered to be prayed over before the school year recommenced. Feucht, an American, said God tasked him with visiting all 50 states, but many, he said, would rather allow drag queen story hour than see Christians praying. Feucht said despite being an American, or perhaps because he is an American, he said he always felt a strong connection between Alberta and the United States, and he also compared the CBC to CNN. He added that he was the most slandered Christian in Canada over the last month, and that his wife's direct messages were full of death threats. True North spoke with supporters and protesters at the concert. One woman who was volunteering at the event told True North the protesters, quote, just needed to find love, adding such protests came from a place of pain. A protester told True North that Feucht was homophobic, transphobic, and supports Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. He said, in fact, that anyone who supports Trump is homophobic by default. Another protester told True North that she supports free speech but not hate speech, and that Feucht was engaged in the latter. Feucht claimed to be the top COVID-19 violator in 39 states. He also recounted that Antifa threw smoke bombs at him during a church performance, noting that the fire alarms, which apparently were usually triggered by mere candles, did not activate, which he called a miracle. Feucht also hosted a communion with bread and grape juice, which he said was extra important to take place at a government high place. In fact, later that night, after all the attendees had left, Feucht had a worship session inside the legislature building, to the dismay of a Trudeau-appointed left-wing partisan senator and many people on the left. Feucht also dedicated a section of the night where people could throw their addictions on stage, during which attendees threw cigarettes, nicotine pouches, and more on the stage. Shortly after, he called anyone willing to come to the stage, which he said symbolized an altar, to fall to their knees and surrender to Christ. Hundreds rushed to the stage and fell to their knees. Attendees knelt in prayer and surrendered as pastors individually prayed with each one of them and anointed many new devotees with oil. Feucht claimed that 5,000 people showed up in Edmonton. He explained that Edmonton's event was far beyond what he ever could have imagined. He said, quote, it's almost like a nation is waking up. The media and the protesters and this push of the enemy is like a last gasp at stopping a kingdom that's unstoppable. Feucht said negative media coverage and protesters' actions paled in comparison to seeing God's glory, such as when teenage girls wept tears of joy after being freed from drugs, suicide, and addiction. And by the way, there were only like 25 protesters there. I saw numbers up to 100. There's no way. It was like 25 to 50, maybe 100 over the night, and some came and went, but yeah. For our next story, newly reviewed federal records show that 13 of Alberta's 44 First Nations have not posted an audited financial statement since at least 2020-21, with some, like Tsuut'ina Nation, not posting since 2014-15. Only 11 of 44 have published a 2023-24 consolidated audit, and the decline followed the federal government's 2015 decision to stop enforcing the First Nations Financial Transparency Act, which requires audited financials and chiefs' counselors' salaries to be posted publicly. Gage Haubrich, Prairie Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, called Ottawa's non-enforcement, quote, very unfortunate. He noted that in non-Indigenous communities, citizens can readily access budgets and salary data online. He said, quote, "It's the most basic part of transparency that we expect from governments of all levels, and First Nations communities shouldn't be left out of that." He added that a lack of posted audits hurts band members who want to ask where money is going, especially in communities facing addiction and poverty. Haubrich also pointed to a case at Frog Lake First Nation saying, quote, "We're working with a number of activists on things like this one from Frog Lake First Nation, who's trying to find out where almost $100 million that used to be in his band's trust fund went. He's being stonewalled." He said better access to documents would have helped the search. SecondStreet.org president Colin Craig, who helped push for the First Nations Financial Transparency Act in 2009 after leaked salary records showed councillors at Pugui First Nations were earning more than the Prime Minister, recalled the law's intent. He said, quote, "Eventually, the government responded by passing the First Nations Financial Transparency Act. Once salaries began being posted nationwide, there were all kinds of stories about band members shocked to find out how much their politicians were making." Craig stressed the aim was to protect community members, not shame leadership. He said, quote, "Lots of chiefs and council members weren't rolling in money while serving their communities. They didn't seem bothered by the transparency law because they were genuinely trying to help their communities. But there certainly were many cases where chiefs and council members were abusing their power to set salaries extremely high and then keep the details hidden. After Ottawa halted enforcement, it promised to co-develop a new approach. In 2016, the federal government and Assembly of First Nations signed an MOU to explore a new fiscal relationship. The Canadian Audit and Accountability Foundation subsequently recommended considering a First Nations Auditor General, with their report concluding, quote, "A First Nations Auditor General would provide many benefits, both today and in the future. Most importantly, First Nations citizens would benefit from the recognized power of audit to improve the delivery of essential public programs and services." In 2017, the federal government held engagement sessions to explore alternatives to the First Nations Financial Transparency Act, but has not introduced a replacement policy or legislation. With Edmonton's neighborhoods bracing for lane reductions, lost parking, and one-way conversions under the active transportation network expansion, Transportation Minister Devin Dreeshen met Delton residents to hear their concerns firsthand in their neighborhood. He spent the first 15 minutes of his roughly 30-minute visit hearing from concerned residents, who raised concerns ranging from emergency vehicle access, loss of parking for homes and businesses, lack of consultation, and their petition showing a majority of residents opposing the bike lanes being ignored by the city. Many residents said handicap parking would be removed, and the city told them to use the back alley, which they deemed unsafe. In fact, one resident, Richard, showed Dreeshen and myself CCTV footage from his back alley of a man being attacked with a machete. Dreeshen, who had just met with Edmonton Mayor Amarjeet Sohi, said Sohi admitted the city's 2019 consultation on bike lanes was broad, not community-specific, and involved only 1% of the population. Conversely, the petition submitted by Delton residents to the city had 292 signatures, a clear majority representing 57% of the homes along the bike lane. Dreeshen told True North his government is drafting legislation to amend the Traffic Safety Act, which will force municipalities to conduct traffic impact assessments when implementing bike lanes that replace driving roads. He confirmed that legislation is the best provincial intervention method. He said, quote, "We obviously don't want to have to do that. If the new councils in Edmonton and Calgary see the light of day in making sure that bike paths are being designed and built that don't actually impede with road and vehicle traffic and parking, then that provincial legislation would never have to be used." He then walked 6 minutes through the community with the lead petitioner in Delton, Jeremiah Rawling, to discuss his concerns one-on-one. Dreeshen questioned Rawling to better understand the community's frustrations. However, Dreeshen referenced the upcoming municipal election, stating that candidates' stances on bike lanes could determine how residents vote, and in fact he said he hoped this would be the case. Mayoral candidates have generally expressed displeasure for bike lanes, at least leading up to the election. Delton residents have criticized City Councillor Ashley Salvador for failing to meet with them, forcing them to invite the province instead. Rawling said Salvador provides copy and paste answers instead of engaging with residents, and she pretty much just advises how things will proceed, citing that 1% general consultation as justification. Before leaving, Dreeshen had Rawling show him the map of the proposed changes at one point. literally just chuckling at the proposal. He was just laughing. He said, quote, "I'll do everything I can," before he left. And the city, of course, fast-tracked Delton's bike lane construction, with completion expected by the end of 2025, just after the municipal election in October. We'll stick with the city of Edmonton for our next story because Edmonton City Council has approved a $50,000 pilot to deploy cameras and microphones that identify noisy vehicles. A first in Canada move that Councillor Michael Jan says is now so precise it can pinpoint exactly what vehicle is emitting that noise. He stressed this tech has been tested in multiple US court challenges and is used in France, the UK, and America, though not yet in Canada. Mayor Amarjeet Sohi said he constantly hears complaints from residents about deliberately noisy vehicles. He said, quote, "People who deliberately disturb the peace of their neighbors, and I have no way to tell them that we are doing something to control it." But administration warned the budget looks unrealistic. For example, a similar pilot in 2020 cost about $200,000, and staffing would require reducing services in other areas. Crucially, acting city solicitor Michael Gunther told councillors the city cannot use the technology for ticketing or enforcement under current provincial law. At best, the pilot could collect data, and privacy implications must be reviewed. Councillor Aaron Paquette called the budget and utility into question. He warned that costs would inevitably grow into broader requests for resources and likened the move to a, quote, Hail Mary. And lots of people, unsurprisingly, reacted negatively on X. For example, the Alberta Prosperity Project asked, quote, "So surveillance?" Another user said, quote, "Ah yes, public surveillance programs for your safety. Danielle Smith, don't let our cities turn into woke, authoritarian sanctuaries." And at the city council meeting, city solicitor Michael Gunther confirmed that even pictures showing silhouettes of people could be considered personal information and raise privacy concerns. The city expects a report on the pilot project to be submitted by early 2027. That wraps up this week's Alberta Roundup. My name's Isaac Lamoureux. Have a great weekend. Thank you, and God bless.